Come on. Okay, we got this. Amber.
Good morning or afternoon.
Right here. Okay. Hi. Yeah.
Hello. How are you doing?
Okay.
Good. You look like you're feeling a lot better.
Yeah, well, I took one of the Ambien things, which, you know, I try not to take because it's not good for me and you can't take very many of them. But so I actually did get some sleep eventually.
Good.
So, yeah, and we're outside.
Oh, even better.
Yeah.
I opened the window.
Yeah. Yes. So, any questions or comments before we begin?
I don't think so. I'll just, I'll go ahead and mute myself unless you need me. I mean,
yeah.
You know, and otherwise I'll just pay attention and then I will look over papers and stuff after Ron Allen goes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, and I think, do you have access to the papers?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And, you know, if there's anything that like I missed something, go ahead and like break in.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't think you'll miss anything.
Well, just in case Ron comes in and I don't see that he's come in or something, I don't know.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah. Okay.
All right. Okay, I'm gonna get my tea.
Hi, James. Hi, Jackie. Hi, Zach.
How are you, Amber?
Doing well. Good. You guys?
A-okay today.
Good. So I think the papers are pretty close to due.
Yes.
Yes. So
I uploaded mine to Populi, but it's in like the little side comments thing. It's a little different than like the big box in the middle. I always get confused on that.
Yeah, so Jackie's and Mary Beth's is in there.
Amber, I'm sending you a text message.
Okay.
Thank you, Amber, for your reply over the weekend. My mom ended up helping me Saturday, so I was able to get ahead. But
so was it COVID or just your run-of-the-mill creeping crud?
I think it was the run-of-the-mill. I have a kindergartner, but it was a week. Yeah. It was a week long, just awful. But she helped me Saturday and I got things regrouped. So.
Glad to hear you're feeling better.
Thank you.
Yes. That's never.
It's scary anymore. Like when you start getting congested and the cough, you know, you don't know whether you should be scared or whether it's like a year and a half ago and you've been like, I'll be fine, take some over the counter.
Yeah. Yeah, it's changed the way we think about everything, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and begin. we're missing one person, but I'm sure she'll join us in just a moment. So let's go ahead and begin. I like to begin with a few moments of reflection and silence. So I wonder if we might reflect a little bit about maybe, you know, I don't know if your church has some kind of thing to say during Lent. I mean, not during Lent, but, you know, a confession of sin. But mine does. So we might reflect upon our own, what does it mean to confess our sins? And let me get my timer. Okay. All right. And let's take a few moments to reflect upon what that means for us. And Adrian?
Yes. Hello, Dr. Allen. It's nice to meet you. I am Adrian Lacey, and I am a second semester MDiv student at CTS.
Great. And Mary Beth?
Hi, Dr. Allen. I'm Mary Beth Mullen, and I'm in Disciples of Christ Church in Terre Haute, Indiana, and I know a lot of your fans here. So,
my wife served as interim minister at Central in Terre Haute for 2 years.
yes, I've heard that, and I've heard a great many wonderful things about both of you.
Oh,
Nice. And James?
Hello, my name is James Rogers. I am a second semester MDiv student.
Wonderful. And we're missing one other person. Amber Good is here too. I don't know if you, was Amber lucky enough to have you in a class, or have you met Amber?
not to my knowledge.
No, I'm glad to meet you, Dr. Allen. Amber Good. I'm a third year MDiv and MTS student, also in the United Methodist Church.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. 2 things before I really begin. One is to say I go by Ron. And secondly, I want to say how highly I value Helene as a colleague. We've been colleagues for 20 years now, and I was on the search committee that called her, and I have never regretted it for a minute. I only wish we could have gotten her sooner.
You are so sweet. You make me happy.
Yeah. Well, I hope my remarks about sin and evil make you happy too. Let me tell you what I'm planning to do, which is talk about my perception of how the Bible relates sin and evil, which are not quite the same, though they are related, and then open up for questions. And along the way, there'll be a little bit about Jesus and how he might relate to the questions of sin and evil. Unlike the book, I'm not trying to go through the whole history of the church. I'm just trying to focus on sin in the Bible, because I don't do much with sin in the book, and weave a little bit about evil into it. And Helene, is it okay if they have questions along the way, or would you rather me talk and then?
Whatever is easiest for you, sir.
Well, I'm happy either way. If something comes up, especially if it's a clarification question along the way, just pop up your hand and I'll try to notice. And if I don't, just say something, and surely that will catch my attention. As I say, I don't really do much with sin in the book, which I think says something about being a disciple of Christ, that is, a member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, in which sin does not have a really high profile in the way that it does in some other churches. So I want to say at the outset, in both the Torah, prophets, and writings, and in the Gospels and letters, the root meaning of the words for sin in Hebrew and Greek are both to miss the mark. Sin is missing the mark. Now, we can also say that in the Bible, there are two broad understandings of sin. There's one in the first 39 books, the Torah, Prophets, and Writings, and there's another one in the Gospels and Letters. It's not that they're unrelated, but they put emphasis in different places. And it's also important to say, you always have to take into account how a particular writer in the Bible uses the notion of sin. So while I'm talking in a broad stroke, you will find that some writers take their strokes in slightly different directions. All these understandings of sin, before I get to the two big ones, a few preliminary remarks, both understandings of sin assume that God offers the world to us and has in mind a vision for how all the elements of creation can live together. And sin is the act of missing the mark of participating in this world in the way that God intends. This is a quick review. Genesis 1 and 2 reveal the nature of the relationships that God would like to have in the created world. Every piece of creation fits together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle so that they are all mutually supportive. Each one has its own integrity. Each one has its own identity. Each one has its own function and purpose, but its function and purpose is not complete apart from being knit into the larger community of support. And this is God's, generally speaking, this is God's purpose in the three major books, three major theological families that make up the first 39 books, the Torah, the Prophets, and the Writings. And it's also true in broad strokes in the Gospels and Letters, though it is articulated there with a more apocalyptic focus. And by the way, this idea of people and the entities of creation living in relationships of mutual support is also a very good way to understand what the Bible means by blessing. To be blessed is to participate in a community in which these mutually supportive dynamics and relationships shape the life of the community. Now, in the Torah, Prophets, and Writings, I'm still dealing with the purposes of God. The primary purpose of God is cast in the language of covenant. God makes a covenant with Israel, which is based on the prior covenant that God made with creation. And the covenant community is one in which people live together in the ways in which I have just described. When we cross into the Gospels and Letters, the language of covenant does not disappear, but it does recede. And in its place is another expression, the realm of God, the kingdom of God, the dominion of God, which takes the qualities of the created world before the fall, this community of mutual support that I have described, and puts them into a larger frame of reference. So God's ultimate purpose is to replace the present world with its brokenness with a brand new world in which all of the qualities of the original creation are restored in such a way that they will no longer break. So this is a kind of background about how I see, anyway, God's overarching purposes. And within this background, Genesis 3 is the key to understanding sin in both the Gospels and Letters, and also in the Torah, Prophets, and Writings. It's the key text, and in the mind of most scholars, associated with schools like CTS, Genesis 3 is what we would call a myth or a mythological explanation of why we experience the world in certain ways. It's another discussion as to whether or not the events in Genesis 3 can be taken in a literal fashion as if they are a report of a historical occurrence. What I see, what most scholars see, is that the Bible writers use God, the garden, Adam and Eve, as characters in a story, the purpose of which is to explain why things are the way they are. Key point, before Genesis 3, there is no sin or evil. Before Genesis 3, everything is together in mutually supportive relationship as God wants it to be. And there is only one rule in the garden, and that rule is not to eat of a certain tree. And that's the only thing that the community, small as it is, Adam and Eve, that's the only rule, guideline they have to obey in order to continue a life in paradise. But what happens? A creature comes along. In Genesis, it is a snake. And in Genesis, the snake is not Satan. In later Jewish literature, the snake is identified with Satan. But in this early part of the Bible, the snake is just a creature, but a creature who goes amok. The snake offers the first couple the opportunity to become like God by violating the one principle that God has laid down for the sustaining of blessing in their paradise existence. They take the fruit from the forbidden tree as an act of choice on their part. They choose to violate God's purposes. In the background here, of course, is idolatry, because what they want is to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and thereby, according to the snake, to become like God. So they, in essence, make idols of their own self-desires. And this carries over into the fundamental sin that dogs Israel, and that is idolatry. And as a matter of fact, that's the fundamental sin that dogs the world of the Gospels and letters also. As a result, and people don't like to hear this, as a result, God curses the man and the woman and the earth, the created world. So sin fundamentally is choosing against God's purposes and then being in a position whereby the consequences of that bad choice fall on you. And it's a choice that not only affects the human being, it also affects the world in which we live. As I say, that's mythological language, but its purpose is to explain why we struggle so much, why we find obedience so difficult, that why the world in which we, oh my goodness, why the world in which we live, even Tangelo, is fractured and not what it could be. So that gets us to the first understanding of sin, which I really already pointed to, and that is, it's found in the first 39 books, and that is violating the covenant, either intentionally or unintentionally. A little better if you violate it unintentionally, but either way, consequences befall you. And that's really a lot of what the Torah, prophets, and writing is about. If you sin, if you violate God's purposes in relationship to other elements of creation, you can expect consequences. And the curse of the earth, just talked about, The curse of the earth illustrates the wider ranges of concern, which is that the consequences of sin spill over into the creation. They're not just a matter of human concern. This is a kind of systems perspective. I mean, the writers of Genesis weren't thinking of systems theory, but they have the notion that everything is interrelated, and when a part of it is gouged, then the whole thing begins to bleed and ache. In this context, to say that God forgives is to say that God relieves you of the consequences of sin and sets you free to become obedient and on the pathway to blessing. There's not so much, I'll come back to this in a minute, there's not so much emphasis on personal guilt here, feeling bad, as there is on a brokenness kind of inhabiting the center of your soul until it is forgiven and you have the opportunity to become obedient again. Now, I'm going to risk a generalization here, which is generally true, but not absolutely true in every case. And that is that in the Bible, both Testaments, God has absolute power. Everything in the world that happens either according to God's initiative or according to God's permission. God doesn't directly cause everything, but because God has absolute power, God could intervene and change the course of things. Evil things happen in the world from this point of view, either at God's initiative or by God's permission. If by God's initiative, direct punishment for some disobedience; if by God's permission, indirect punishment, either because of some disobedience or because of, now I've lost my train of thought. I'm thinking on two levels of my mind at the same time. I need to get caught up with my own thinking. Either by God's direct punishment or by God's indirect curse on the fallen world as a reminder of the finitude or the brokenness of creation. So in this way of thinking, God does not directly cause all natural disasters, but God has left the world in a broken state and allows the brokenness of the world, the elements of the world as a result of poor choices, to fall under devastation. So there is an exception to this viewpoint. Everybody knows it. It's Job and some of the wisdom writers, but that is an exception. And even where this viewpoint is not expressly in the texts, it is usually assumed. So sin, choice, consequences, forgiveness, not making you captive to the consequences that you brought about as a result of your choice, and giving you a fresh start. So that's the first notion of sin. The second one is in the Gospels and Letters. And I just remind you that the Gospels and Letters, the last 27 books, are apocalyptic in orientation. The first 39 books are not. They presume the world as it is, just going on and on. The second 27 books assume that things are so bad in the world, there will come a time of replacement. Now, this is a key point. In the Second Testament, sin is a cosmic power. The writers often talk about sin as if it's a personification. It's a cosmic power that works in the world rather like a super person. And then again, this is very much a systemic point of view. Because it's a power, it's at work in all the worldly systems in order to try and claim those systems away from God. Sin gets you in its grip and won't let you go. It's as if sin has its arms around you and you can't free yourself. It has substance, it has initiative, it has power. This is really, I think, the clearest in the writings of Paul. But if you have this notion in mind, you can hear it all over the 27 books, except the ones that come from the hand of John. Why did this apocalyptic worldview come about? Because a good number of Jewish theologians felt that their experience of the brokenness of the world, the experience of evil, particularly as transmitted through the empires that ruled the Holy Land, this experience was so intense, it involved more than human choice. We sin by cooperating with the power of sin, but sin in the Gospels and letters is much more than an individual or even community choice. In this context, but I must add, within a world in the grip of sin, we are nonetheless responsible for the choices that we make. And in back of sin is the problem of idolatry, for Satan has tried to claim for himself the glory, the honor, the place that belongs only to God, and uses sin as a way of trying to bring people into his embrace. And we participate in sin when we go along with the violation of the purposes of the world that are perpetrated by Satan through sin. So in this context, what is forgiveness? In this context, forgiveness is being freed from the grip of the alien power. Sin is being freed. Grace, forgiveness, means being freed from the grip of sin. Important point here, the world will not be fully released from this power until after the apocalypse. That is, until the second coming. This is a Gospels and Letters point of view. Until the second coming, the world will never be completely free of sin. And this is why there is so much emphasis, especially in Paul and in the later letters, there's so much emphasis on the work of God setting you free from sin. It's because the writers envision you actually bound up. What does Jesus do? And I'm winding down here. What does Jesus do in this way of thinking? And the answer is that God uses Jesus as the agent of divine power through which God breaks the grip of sin on the world by allowing Jesus to be put to death by the empires of the old age, which gives God the opportunity to raise him from the dead and demonstrate that no matter how fearsome the power of Satan, sin, and death, God's power is greater. Very important point as I'm ending here. In the Second Testament, this is true in the first two, just not to the same intensity. In the Second Testament, forgiveness is not just a judge pronouncing innocent people who are really guilty. In the Second Testament, forgiveness is God breaking the power of sin over individuals and communities and freeing them to live toward the realm of God. The tie to the old world is cut, and replaced by a power, the Spirit, the resurrected Jesus, that makes it possible to live not under the aegis of the old age completely, but to live toward the new. Of course, as I said a moment ago, this side of the second coming, this is an ambiguous state, because while God has broken the grip, God has not taken away the sin. And so communities seeking to be faithful are still buffeted by sin and will be so until the second coming. And the motif of choice enters in here, because once you've been baptized and are living toward the realm of God, you still have to make choices day by day, sometimes moment by moment, as to which values and practices you are going to live. But within the old age, while making way toward the realm of God, the community of the faithful can live as agents or witnesses who point to and teach the ways of and work the works of the realm of God. So notice something that isn't here, that is so prominent in much Christian theology, and that is the idea of original sin in the sense of the human being born into the world, a little bundle of guilt that has to be immediately forgiven. That's a way of thinking that comes into Christian theology only after the church begins to make its way into realms of thought that are really controlled by Hellenistic philosophical presuppositions, where state of being is such an important factor in the way that it isn't in the way of Jewish thinking. So that's what I have for a starting point, and I'm happy to entertain questions. Really happy to hear your thoughts and reactions, things that may have been new to you, things that were old hat, and if I ever do this again, I don't need to repeat, that kind of thing.
Dr. Allen, that's so very helpful. It's such a powerful and clear encapsulation of how sin and evil and redemption and God and what we're called to and what it means to be in relationship with God as a community and as individuals. It's wonderfully helpful. I took notes. So I'm going to leave this over to the students. I could call up you if you want me to.
No, I'm hopping in.
Hi, James.
First off, thank you for your perspective. One of the things that I do often when, learning or breaking down ideas, I usually try to relate it back to something else I know. So when you were talking, one of the things that kept popping into my head was the story of the woman caught in adultery, and where I forgot the original part where it popped in my head, but the second piece where you were saying, as far as the Second Testament goes, that it's not just a judge forgiving somebody for who is in fact guilty or just guilty, but that it's a freeing. I was thinking of the line at the end where he's asking her, like, where are your accusers? And then he's telling her, have I accused you or have I condemned you? And he's like, he's saying, go and sin no more. Like that freeing of her in that aspect is like, whether or not you committed it or you did or did not, that's not the issue here now.
Exactly.
The thing going forward, don't do it anymore.
That's right. You're no longer controlled by that part of your past.
Right.
Yeah.
I thought that was a big highlight for me. And then something I was thinking about too as well. Is actually in New Testament, our New Testament class. We were discussing Pharisees and what they their idea of being unclean does not equate to evil and bad.
Right, exactly.
So for you, is sin similar in the same regard as far as like sin doesn't necessarily mean evil and bad, it's just missed the mark. And I guess my question would then be, what is considered evil and bad?
Well, to be unclean is really to be out of place, which is, that's an abbreviation. And that's not evil or bad, but it's awkward. A sin is a violation of God's fundamental purposes. It's bad. Now, in the Bible, they don't really have degrees of sin, but you do a bad thing when you harm another person, you make a choice that harms another person. You do a bad thing when you make a choice that harms yourself. That doesn't mean, as we would say today, you're a bad person. It means you're making bad choices. And sometimes we make so many bad choices, or we live in a world in which there have been so many bad choices, we hardly have an opportunity to make good ones because there are so many things closing in on us. But sin is bad. Sin contributes to evil, but in my mind, evil is a bigger category than sin.
Gotcha. Because I was thinking about, when I always think of unclean, I'm thinking of the things regarding the priest, or like so like I think about, for example, or I think unclean, I'll think like considering our diets or what we eat, as far as like, you're not supposed to eat pork, you're not supposed to eat this, you're not supposed to eat that, and doing so can make you unclean. But that, it was something I had been struggling with, because I was like, does that equate to an actual sin? Or is like, because I wouldn't think you eating a ham sandwich is you sinning, but
well,
to them,
in its context, it is. But
right.
that's a discussion we can't. I think it takes us farther afield than we could really go this afternoon.
Right.
But you're not. But the whole point of forgiveness, and just to be explicit, the Jewish religion has a mechanism for forgiveness. You don't need Jesus to have forgiveness. But the whole point of forgiveness is that you're not held hostage. You're not trapped by eating that sandwich.
Gotcha.
So I mean, to bring it into like sins that are not explicit or limited to following a particular Jewish tradition. So you're not held hostage by sins that you've committed. Maybe those sins are, lying or cheating or stealing. You're not held hostage by them.
That's right.
They don't inhibit once you have forgiveness, you're still able to have relationships with God and with others.
Yes.
So on that note, the freeing or the not being held hostage by that sin, I guess I'm struggling that not being held hostage by it does not mean that you are permanently free from that particular sin. Like you won't do it anymore. Like you have now this, is it a proclamation that you now have power not to do that anymore, or that you will not experience the consequence of that sin anymore?
It's more on the order that you have the power not to repeat. But because we live in a world that has so many sin structures in it, the temptation is always to repeat. But there is a counter force in the world, which is sometimes called the Holy Spirit, the presence of the resurrected Jesus, the living God, that offers you a reservoir of strength out of which to make a right choice. But because we're finite, we have a tendency to repeat. And this is where a passage like 70 times 7 becomes very helpful. That there is within the tradition itself a recognition of that you are responsible, but also the recognition that you may not be able to be responsible as you should be in every situation. So God, it's one of God's marvelous provisions of grace.
Well, it made me think of Paul when he was talking about the good that I want to do, I don't do, but I do the very things that I don't want to do, those things I find myself doing.
Right. But he's not held captive to those things that he does not want to do.
And I have a question a little bit off from exactly what you spoke about, but so I grew up Catholic, and as a Catholic, I had to go to confession, and then I had to say prayers and be forgiven that way. And now being a disciples of Christ, it's very different, as you kind of pointed out. In the Bible, how did I receive forgiveness, especially in the Old Testament? I mean, is it just, hey, I did wrong?
Well, of course, the Jewish community had regular parts of its life that were dedicated to communicating forgiveness. In Judaism, as is supposed to be the case in Christianity, you go and confess what you've done, you own up to it, you take responsibility for it, and then God has provided the most memorable way through the sacrificial system. God has provided a means to assure you of forgiveness in just about one of the most dramatic ways possible. And Judaism often accompanied acts of forgiveness with acts of reparation, that if you had come and sought forgiveness for a sin that damaged a relationship or a person, then before that sin was really fully released, you had to go to that person, pay back the debt, give them back the tool you stole, fix up the relationship. So there's an really active element. That was a part of the early church, at least in some quarters, but has, for the most part, been lost. Something I might comment on briefly, and that is the communal nature of sin in the world of the Bible, in distinction from the almost entirely individualistic notion of sin that has been a part of so many churches. Of course, in the world of the Bible, you're a member of a community and you're responsible for what you say and do in the community, and you're held personally responsible for violations. But you think of sin in relationship to how you are in the community. And the community is there to support and receive you after the violation, when you have repented and started afresh. And forgiveness is often a public act, and often takes place in the context of smaller communities where people know one another and in which they have actual face-to-face conversation about what they have violated and how they need to make restitution and restore relationships to the quality God wants them to be. Contrast that to the way in which a fair number of churches portray sin as my own personal guilt. Well, I don't need to go there, but it's as if you're existing in a bubble and your actions pertain only to you. And on Sunday morning, in the churches that have a prayer of confession, you can make your prayer of confession, and the minister or the priest can pronounce forgiveness. And it all just takes place between you and God, with the priest or minister as an agent representing God. Whereas certainly in Judaism and in the early church, forgiveness often had a much more communal aspect to it, which I think could be very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's kind of because I've read and I understood kind of some of the rituals. But when I was a child, if we went to confession and I said I hit my sister, then, aside from prayers, there would be, you have to go apologize to your sister. So just kind of how, that it doesn't just happen in a bubble, and not following that completely in different churches, how that works, or not how it works, but what the concepts are of what forgiveness entails.
The confessional system, as you experienced it as a Catholic, had some problems, but it also had some strengths.
Can you go back to your statement on what it means to be blessed? I think you said blessing is participating in this community.
Yes. The full context of blessing, to be fully blessed, is to participate as a covenantal member of the covenantal community, in which all participants, all elements, work together for the good of all and the good of each. It's a community of mutual support in which every element has its own identity and integrity, its own place, and in which everything happens according to God's purposes for relationships and other things. There's often a misconception on the Christian side that the Jews thought blessing had a material quality. Well, you're darn right they did, because blessing in its fullest sense takes account of the whole human being, your material as well as your non-material dimensions.
Well, and especially, I think it's important to think about it in relation to what's going on in the Hebrew scripture in particular. People are not rich. I mean, there might be a few people that are rich, right? Like king and stuff, right? But, when you're talking about personal, I mean, they didn't have 401ks, right? They had the community, right? They had their family. So it's almost more like, rather than, a blessing of I'm going to have tons and tons of money, it's more like a blessing of having enough.
Having enough, having the resources you need so that you can give your best to the community without being distracted by the questions of where am I going to sleep? Where am I going to get food? Where am I going to get money? Yeah, exactly. And as far as the wealthy, there is an attitude in the Hebrew Bible, and this is really also quite evident in the book of Acts and other places in the last 27 books, that the community has a kind of claim on your resources. It's not what we think of as socialism, but it's a situation in which if you have resources and there are people in the community who are in need, then your resources are to go to that need. You have no right to keep them to yourself. That's a violation of God's purpose. That's making yourself the God over the idol, over what you will do with your resources. Now, we've basically lost that notion completely in our culture.
Well, in all cultures, I mean, in most cultures, I should say, it's not just in the United States. And I mean, I think modern, postmodern world,
Yeah.
I think we're much more engaged individually or familiarly, right?
Yeah.
You might think of a whole family unit. You know, you can do your taxes together, you know, with the baby and, you know, the mother and the father, but not the whole neighborhood or the whole congregation.
Yeah.
Ron, do you have, I really appreciate you coming to visit us and to share with us. Do you have something you can say about Jesus?
There are, in my view,
Yeah.
two main pictures of Jesus in the Gospels and letters. In the Synoptic Gospels, Paul, the book of Revelation, most of the 27 books, Jesus is pictured as an apocalyptic prophet whose mission is to announce that the great transition between the old age and the new is underway in the context of his own ministry and will be complete only at the second coming. And if you want to be a part of this great movement, you need to repent and live according to the covenantal values. The other picture of Jesus in the Gospels and letters is the Gospel of John, which presupposes not two ages, old and new, but more, you remember your introduction to philosophy and Plato, the two-story universe, heaven above and the world below, that goes on and on and on. In John, the letter, and also in the letters and also the gospel, and to a certain degree in the book of Hebrews, Jesus is the revealer who comes down into the lower sphere and reveals to people who are trapped in darkness the way to the light. And most of the images about Jesus, language used for Jesus in the 27 books can be explained according to the apocalyptic nature of this big uber perspective. I just want to go back to this point one more time. I said it earlier, but I don't want it to be missed. The Jewish community had forgiveness before Jesus. Jesus was not the beginning of love, peace, joy, and so on, and forgiveness. From the viewpoint of the Bible itself, the work of Jesus is to announce this great transition and to prepare people for it. That the new thing is not what he does, but the time frame that he signals. That's quite different from a good bit of Christian theology today.
Yeah.
Quite different.
And does it have anything to do with opening the covenant to non-Jews?
Yeah, this is a really good point. It will take me a minute to explain it if I can have the time. One of the great mistakes of Christian theology Christian religion is to view the first 39 books and the religion and the people that are in it in a negative light, as unfulfilled and incomplete. Whereas the emphasis in the Gospels and letters is on Jesus as means through which God will restore creation. Oh, I forgot to mention where I'm going here. In the first 39 books, one of the great Christian mistakes is to view the chosen quality of Israel, elected, the chosen people, as if they were chosen for some special honor to the dismay of all the other peoples of the world, whereas it's very clear in the documents themselves that Judaism understands itself to be chosen by God in order to show the other peoples of the world the true nature of God and the way toward real blessing, so that they would be able to avoid idolatry and the consequences that would come from it. with Jesus, the actualization of the welcome of Gentiles in large numbers into a community that viewed itself as a Jewish group, at least initially, so that the church becomes a gathering place in the Old Age and New Age language. In the Old Age, the human community is fractious and bitterly divided, especially between Jews and Gentiles, whereas in the coming world, Judaism is not eliminated, but Jews and Gentiles are gathered together, Jews as Jews, Gentiles as Gentiles, under the sovereignty of the one God, made possible by the realm creating ministry of Jesus. The biggest problem in the Gospels and letters, well, one of the two biggest problems, is how the church, with its Jewish origins and its Jewish Savior, how the church can relate to Gentiles and what Gentiles need to do to become a part of its, I say fellowship. It's not institutional membership. It's a part of its, a part of the movement toward the realm. The other big question is, how does the church, which is a Jewish group, relate to other Jews? And that's a story that has a very sad ending. In a sense, the child turned its back on its mother, not in the world of the New Testament, but by the 4th century. Yes, James.
So are you saying what we believe, or a majority of Christians, what they believe, what the negative context is, or towards Judaism, is that we believe they put themselves on a higher pedestal, thinking that they were supposed to save the world, versus like the idea that Judaism is not necessarily Jewish people weren't necessarily out to convert Gentiles to Judaism, but to give them the understanding of who God is. Is that what you're saying?
Well, actually, in the world of the 1st century, Judaism was a missionary religion. Okay. They sent missionaries. How did Paul get the model for his mission? He got it from the fact that Jews were doing the same thing, only without Christ. So it was a missionary religion which sought to bring people into the knowledge of the one living, true God, and to do that by way of Judaism. I think what happened is that under the impetus of Jesus and the apocalyptic hope, the early church turned away from asking Gentiles to take on the full quality of the Jewish lifestyle, because they didn't think there was going to be much time, that the second coming would come soon. And what do we have here in the church? We have an emergency hospital for Gentiles. What do you need to do? Give up your idols and live in love with one another. What's the core of Judaism? Worshiping one God and living together in covenantal community. I sometimes describe it as Judaism light, L-I-T-E. But then it doesn't take very long until the means becomes the end as far as the church is concerned. And because of the tensions with Judaism, the two, by the 4th century, had basically become different religions.
I think you just sparked a light bulb in my head when you said the emergency of it, because I think I never really honed in on that aspect. We were talking about the Sadducees, the Essenes, and all these other groups, and just that concept of like it's coming soon. Jesus is coming. Yeah. The second coming is coming soon. So this is an emergency. We gotta forget the aspect of like maybe Gentiles won't convert if they think they have to get circumcised, or we have to do this, or all these different rules and regulations. Now it's like, no, we got to do this before the day comes.
Right.
Like, so that emergency aspect just really clicked with me, because I think it's Peter and Paul, they're like sending different communications to the churches and different ideas on like, where do you stand? I always looked at that like, why did we not have a consensus or the already know like this is what it was before you got out there into that ministerial aspect of like, do we need to get circumcised? Do we need to follow the law from the Old Testament? Do we have to do this or this and this? So that makes a lot more sense to me now. Yeah. Of why some of those things were not as important for the saving of the soul. If we're going to, like, it could be today, it could be tomorrow.
The purpose of the commandments, 600 commandments, is to imbue the Jewish community with its own distinct identity, to insulate them as much as possible from idolatry and the kind of sin we've been talking about. And if you think, and to carry them through history. If you think the world is about to end, then a lot of those things no longer become so important, because you don't need them to carry you through history. What you need is these two core values, which the earliest church did not perceive to be in conflict with Judaism at all.
It kind of reminds me of the meeting I had this morning with Academic Council, as we're talking about Zooming, and how a year ago in March, all the rules, very strict rules of you can only Zoom 3 classes, and you can only Zoom this much or that much, and you can only have this percentage, all went out the window because we're in the middle of an emergency. Yep. And so how can we do this? Well, let's everybody Zoom everything, right? So now if the apocalypse were coming, we'd just stay Zooming. But if we get to a point like in the Academic Council today, where we're thinking the apocalypse may not be coming, so, and we may be able to safely get back into person. So let's consider that option instead of just staying where we are right now. I don't know if it's exactly the same thing, but it is a sense of this urgency that we got to do this right now. We don't have time to like set things up so that everything's in order perfectly, and going against some of the rules that we used to do. We used to think it was really important that we not have Zooming all the time. Now everybody's Zooming.
All the time. Yeah. Anything more? I'm happy to stay as long as there's interest, but I know you have a further agenda for your class today.
I appreciate you being here very much, Ron. And you have stated things so very clearly, and I love seen James make the connection. Maybe some other folks are making a connection too with their course that they're taking with the other Dr. Allen, Amy Linderman Allen. And I'm not sure that she calls it Gospels and Letters. She might call it Intro to the New Testament right now, but we're working on that. Does anybody else have any questions? Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Ron. I really appreciate it. If you could just stay on just for a second. Yeah. I'm going to invite folks. We're going to take a break, but we'll go ahead and take a break. We'll come back, and then we'll have a few minutes of time together, and then we'll get into our small groups. So let's come back in about 15, 20 minutes. So that would be, let's come back about 2:50. Does that work for folks? 2:50? Okay. All right. Well, we'll see you then.
And I will go ahead and Zoom out.
Okay. Thanks for staying, Amber. I know you wanted to see Dr. Allen.
No problem. Thank you for allowing me to stay.
Wonderful. I'm glad you were able to stay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Allen, Will and Betsy Hines said if I ever met you to say hello for them.
Please convey my greetings back.
I will. They're my mentors for student ministry, so it's been an awesome experience.
Excellent. Are you serving as your student ministry in Central?
Yes.
Good, good.
Yeah.
Well, Ron, thank you so much. That was fabulous.
Well,
just perfect.
Elaine, you're my biggest fan.
Oh, well, I'm probably not, but I'm definitely one of the big fans. Yeah, it was so clear.
Does it seem like it'll be all right for tomorrow night? I'm open to suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, for you to come, or did you want me to just record what you've said?
Oh, no. For me to come and do the same thing.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was perfect. Yeah, it was great. Everybody wants to know if it's your birthday because you have it's your birthday mug.
No, it's not. That's an accident. It's a big mug. I like big mugs.
I know. I said, no, he's a Taurus, so he can't be.
Oh, very good.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, that was really good. And I love the connections that people are making in their minds from the New Testament courses as well.
Yes, I was pleased about that.
Yeah, great. Well, let me know if there's anything that you need me to do, and I'll see you tomorrow at 6:30ish.
Very good. I've enjoyed this a lot.
Well, I really enjoy you being here, so thank you so much.
Peace to you.
Okay, peace. Before we move into a small group discussion, so hopefully you've taken a look at the material there about the Peasants' War from Duke and Stone, and there's two different questions, and so you'll be thinking about which question that you think your group would like to discuss. I'm hoping one group will pick one and one group will pick the other, so we'll have both of those issues addressed. But before we do that, let me go back to the PowerPoint. Now you go ahead and take a look at the PowerPoint even after class, because I've gone through and as you can see, like I have a whole section here on Ron's book, Complete with the Goldfish, about different, helping you to think about what the different theological assumptions are you have about the different views. So there's different views of understanding of evil in the Bible and of sin. There's different views of understanding of evil and sin in the history of Christianity. And then also COVID is the symbol for the current temporary sin and evil and suffering that's happening in our community. And then there's questions for your discussion too about what your understandings of evil are. And then there's a whole section here on Jesus and the work and person of Jesus. And Ron does a nice job of talking a lot about who Jesus is. So I suggest that you take a look at this PowerPoint, because I think it'd be helpful to remind you of what's going on in that chapter as and before or along with the reading of Howard Thurman over Holy Week for our discussion when we return to talk about who Jesus is. And Howard Thurman offers a particular view of Jesus in a particular context in which he's living, which is not that much different than our current context, unfortunately. And then I'm asking you to reflect upon these questions, so to take time over Holy Week, reflect upon your images of Jesus. I think I've mentioned that earlier, but just, what's ever going on in your church, your worship community, what are the ones that speak most to you? What are the ones that maybe this year feel a little bit weird or feel like, not sure that that's really helpful. It seems a little anti-Semitic, or how does that work with whatever's going on for you? So I just want to draw your attention to the rest of the PowerPoint, even though I'm not going to go over it. Instead, I want us to talk about, how we understand sin, how we understand the role of God's grace and human action in sin, how we, maybe imagine, is God's grace in addressing sin something that is unconditional or uncontrollable, irresistible, or what's the role of human decision and effort and even request. So I'm inviting you to take a look at this, and I'm just going to let you all read it because there's a lot here, and I'm going to encourage you to take a look at this and reflect upon your own embedded assumptions about how you understand sin. And it may very well be that sin is one of those things that I think sometimes we think we are, we explicitly would argue that sin is one thing. But when push comes to shove, or when we're in the context of not being conscious and thinking theologically, we may assume, we may act as though there are other understandings of sin, or that other understandings of sin are effective in the way that we experience our guilt and our life. I mean, my mother, she was a little round. And she would always talk about her favorite sin is chocolate. And that, that's fun. We can talk about that, right? But do you really, is sin something that you think about when you're eating? Or, what is it you think about? How is it you really actually understand sin? Are there ways in which, I think this is where Matthias Byers' work with our God images that can be violent and retributive, that or act out against us when we do things that aren't exactly right, or maybe we thought God wanted us to do this and we didn't do it. How does that guilt and retribution function in our inner lives may be problematic, and it might not fit with our explicit non-embedded theological claims about who sin is. So go ahead and just reflect on these are just some different ideas about sin. We might also reflect upon Ron Allen's discussion about sin in the Bible. So now I'd also like us to take a look at the Peasants' War. And this is in our How to Think Theologically. And I'd like us to think about that. What's this say? Group discussion. Okay, yes. So I want us to, so there's two different options here in our group discussion, but before we do that, I just want to go over the article that I asked you to read about the sin of racism. I hope people had a chance to take a look at that. Did people have a chance to take a look at that? Well, I just want to maybe summarize it because I think it offers a particular perspective on something that is obviously current and has been current for a long time, but I think we're thinking about it and talking about it more explicitly these days. So Keller offers or argues that racism is the sin of discounting the image of God that is within each one of us. So each human is sacred and worthy of respect and love, and that is a tenet of Christianity. It's also a tenet of Judaism, that God made each of us in unique ways that reflect the complexity and uniqueness of God's own image. So this is a claim that even though we don't all look alike, each of us is. So there's two ways of looking at this in Christian tradition. One way is to say, well, it's something that we all have in common. So if you look at people like Augustine and some of the older theologians, they might talk about it in terms of an ability to reason or ability to be self-conscious, or Wesley, who talks about it as an ability to love. And more contemporary folks might talk about it as more summative rather than reductive, right? So that the image of God includes all of us. So all of us look different, right? We look different in terms of our race and in terms of our gender. Someone's knocking at my door, I apologize. And how is that? And we all have different qualities. And how is that then reflected? I mean, is the image of God reflected in that? And hang on just one second. Someone's trying to get in. So, oh, it's Rich, the boyfriend. I'm teaching.
I brought your lettuce. So.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was apologizing to you guys actually. Anyway, so I think that it's important to think about how we understand the sin of racism, right? It's impacted by how we understand what it means to be in the image of God, right? So to disrespect, hate, or harm others because their image of God looks different than our image of God is a problem, right? It's wrong. It harms other people and it disrespects the aspect of God that they reflect. Matthew reminds us that when we do something to or for or against another person, we do it to Christ. So the Bible gives us many examples of God's love for persons from both testaments, God's call and commandment to love our neighbors, to love the other as ourselves, to remember God, that Jesus bids us to love our enemies as well. So there's no special treatment for those who look like us or even for those who are kind to us or on our side nationally, politically, personally, or even which team we're pulling for in March Madness. That was for you, Rich. Jesus bids us to heal these divisions. And as you saw from Ron's presentation, God seems to be calling us to live in communities in which love dominates. And Paul also highlights this. And you notice he talks about in Paul, when he talks about the union or that in Christ there is no Greek nor Jew, nor male nor female. The prophet Isaiah and St. John of the Apocalypse, that would be the book in Revelation, also share this vision of the people of God consisting of every tongue, every tribe, every person, every people, every nation. That's in the book of Revelation. And in Micah and Isaiah, all peoples will flow under the mountain of God, all peoples. And they will worship their gods, but they will all come together. It seems to offer an image of diversity that is embraced by God in both testaments, embraced by the images of God in both testaments, sorry. All right. Then Keller goes on to offer advice toward changing people's hearts, minds, and behavior about race, and particularly racism. He argues that, and this is a quote, if we see racism as just one way, though a horrendous way, to establish righteousness and identity of ourselves apart from God's salvation, then we keep the necessary sense of being a part of a fallen community, a fallen humanity. We only can do that if we look at racism as one destructive manifestation of something that absolutely every person is doing in their heart. If we forget this, then the only way to address people complicit in racism is to denounce them, which has little effect but to aggravate our divisions. So he's calling for a understanding of racism as systemic sin and calling for us to repent of that and to see that we are connected, more connected than we know. I'm curious about your response. Might be something to reflect and think about. If you think that the differences and similarities between us do the differences outweigh the similarities, and should the differences then be held as the norm rather than the community of us coming together? It's I think an important way to reflect upon what our assumptions are and how we approach our participation in racism and how we approach our repentance of our racism and how we work to dissolve the racism that's within us. So I think it's really important to note the difference here between explicit individual racism and an implicit racist system that's systemic. As I think most of us are probably not participating in explicit individual racism, but all of us are participating in an implicit systemic racism to some degree or another. The same thing can be said about sexism, I think, but this is the focus is on racism. But we're stuck in this sort of systemic world in which sin reigns, in which the powers of sin it's bigger than us. It's bigger than me being able to make a single decision right now, right? There's all these other influences that fight against me being to make an individual free decision. So the author then raises a point that I think may shed light on our current situation in the United States. So, and this is a little bit about what we were talking about from Ron in the discussion about the biblical worldview. So most cultures, or some of our cultures, including the worldviews that are articulated in the Bible, people are not viewed as individually responsible for their own sins, their own particular sins, but rather they bear the marks of the past as well as the present community to which they belong. So thus Israelites are responsible for what the members of its community and nation did or are doing. We see this way of thinking in the Hebrew scripture as well as in the New Testament, where the consequences of sins of ancestors are passed down to many generations. We also see this corporate responsibility with the Puritans and the Pilgrims that came to the Americas long ago, in which sinful individuals, I don't know if you know very much about that history, if you've taken history classes yet or not, but individuals are punished by being excommunicated from the community to avoid God's wrath upon the whole society. So this way of thinking then sees the sins of the fathers and the great-great-great-grandfathers and grandmothers haunting the current generation with punishments. Now, I think this view, which is seen in the Bible, is not the way that typically we think about individual responsibility. We might be aware that the sins of our great-great-grandfathers have contributed to the systemic nature of racism and systemic problems that we have today, which are include a variety of things, including sexism and environmental problems and the crazy disparity between rich and poor, and a variety of things that we could go on forever to talk about. But the Bible then, noting this, we don't, even though we're aware that the past does impact us, we don't espouse the official punishment of a child because of the sins of her grandparents, right? We would think that would be horrible, right? I would think it would be like, what are you're punishing this 6-year-old child because of something her grandfather did. But we do still see the negative impact of the actions and inactions of the generations before us, particularly in relation to systemic issues like racism, like the environmental crisis. So the Bible also attends to the corporate nature of unjust systems that are carried forward in time. And this is an interesting thing that occurs in biblical community that doesn't occur for us. And that is the Jubilee years. I don't know if you all are familiar. I don't know if they talked about Jubilee years in your Bible classes, but so that idea, which died out a long time ago, but is the idea that every 50 years, property would be restored to those who had lost it. Debts and wrongdoings were forgiven. The land and the animals were allowed to rest an entire year. So we didn't plant anything. You had to store up enough to have enough. Not working the animals. Imagine that even just for a couple of days, letting the cows just be cows and the chickens just run around like chickens. Letting the debt that you've accumulated or your parents accumulated be erased or be eased. The strict attention to the land and property events in early Israelite practice, of course, died out. True justice is not simply the purview of individuals, but is also about the overall systems in which we live. And I think this is a really important element for us to contend with and think about, because it's not our typical American capitalist system, right? But it is a biblical view, right? It's a biblical understanding of what do we mean by true justice and how can we participate toward it. The structures that are in place have become ingrained in our living. I mean, it's hard enough to like get out of the habit of when you get up in the morning, what do? Right? I mean, we get these simple little habits, but imagine these habits that are unconscious and have become part of the tax system. It's just kind of crazy to think about it. I was just doing my taxes this weekend. What counts as something that you can take off your taxes? What do you get a tax relief for, and what do you not? And what, I mean, I'm sure it's really complicated for corporations, which are now people, evidently, but the details of that and to try to change all of that to make it more just is so complicated, because companies have set up the whole system that this is how they function. If they can't take those tax write-offs, then the company's afraid that it might go bankrupt, or the people that are in charge aren't going to get as much money. And so it's overwhelming. So I'm going to not continue with that part. But anyway, so anyway, these structures have become so ingrained that we only question them when something doesn't fit. It reminds me of the paradigm discussion that we only, that people could see, you could see aliens come down and you wouldn't recognize them. That's probably an exaggeration, but you could take a look at the night sky years and years ago, right? Centuries ago, look at the night sky, and you could be able to observe these things. These stars are moving at the same sort of pace that you can track them. And it took a long time for someone to figure out and say, that's because they're different than the other lights in the sky. These things are planets and not stars. They're much closer to us, so to speak. Anyway, so, I mean, I think that, you know, that's part of the way I think that's an important element in how we're understanding what happens or how we get to this place where white supremacy and racism are such a norm. Like, how do we get there, and how can we get out of it is the big question, right? It's become such a normative part of our structure that people who aren't explicitly racist, aren't explicitly white supremacists, still have beliefs or function in ways or activities that participate or contribute to the system of white supremacy without having any intention to do that, without even any knowledge of it. So I think that it's important for us to root those out, kind of using the skills that we've developed with uncovering our embedded assumptions about God and about religion to also uncover some embedded assumptions we have about race, about color, about different communities. I'm trying to get this through this quickly so we can get into our small groups, but are there any questions so far? Okay, great. So Keller points out several examples of how this system of racism and white supremacy has become part of our normative structure. For example, about how schools are funded from the taxes in a community where people live. They send their kids to school. So poorer neighborhoods have less money for their schools, and less money then leads to poorer quality of education. Poor quality of education does not help the folks that are in poor neighborhoods, many of them are African-American, get better jobs. So this cycle continues to repeat. You know, the whole notion of redlining, I think, was such a powerful example of that. There's a lot of examples. At any rate, for us to reflect upon those and learn about those and how to fix them, how to change that. Keller calls white people to repent for violating this image of God in our brothers and sisters. And he calls us to bear the fruit of repentance in our action. Now, he offers a couple of suggestions for how to do that. I think that he's kind of short on those suggestions, but I'm wondering, so one suggestion he talks about is to form multiracial church communities, sharing power, mixing cultures. I mean, I'm not keen on that idea because I think it tries to push people into communities that they don't necessarily want to be in. And I'm more keen on the idea of of church communities that are predominantly white, predominantly Black, having times together, like learning from each other, having dinners together. I mean, in some way, it's a little bit similar to the interdenominational work or the interreligious work where Jews and Christians could come together and have a meal together and talk about their different styles of worship. Now, obviously, the idea of having multiracial churches is great if that's works for folks. My experience as an Episcopalian is we've got probably 10, maybe 15% of persons of color that come to our church. But it seems to me that there's a different kind of culture around Christian worship in many African-American churches. And so to suggest that should be abandoned, I think is problematic. But anyway, I wonder if other people have, if you want to share right now, that'd be fine, or just reflect upon it. Like, how can we bear fruit of the repentance of racism? What other ways can we make changes in both our thinking and in our acting, individually and communally, explicitly or implicitly? Big question.
I was actually thinking about this morning as I was going back through Crawford's book, because I kept coming across things that I really that really spoke to me about relationship to hope, and the idea of Jesus being very much central in the here and now of your experience, and especially this year, I feel like we've needed that more than ever. But being able to hear it from the women that Crawford works through, their stories and things, I was like, how can I bring this to my church to basically show them how to listen to a perspective that's not their own? Because that's, I feel like that's one of the bigger issues. If we can't relate to it, we don't want it, or we don't want to take the time to do it because we feel like if it doesn't serve us in some way, then it's not worth our time. But that's not the point. It's to learn from another person's life experience. It's the point is to learn from another person's perspective and to understand that we are not the only ones here. The world goes beyond our own nose. The experience of life is a lot more diverse than what some believe it to be. And so I think the big one is learning to listen in a way that you're not trying to get something out of somebody, but you're trying to give back and to actually expand your understanding of another person.
Thank you, Zach. Any other comments?
I think one of the things that that attracted me to the church I'm at was that there is a real movement constantly in this church to be out of the church and with other people. Like the youth group every year makes a point of attending throughout the year. They attend 6 churches of different denominations where the kids experience different services. And they at least a couple times a year, we have a sing along with, we have become sister church with a Black church in town. And a couple times a year, our social justice sets up panels where, so the interfaith counselors come in and had, different denominations. We've had a group of, and again, kind of privileged to live in a town with 4 colleges, because we have people who are very willing to educate and come in as educators. But we've had a panel of Black people. We've had an Asian panel that came in and talked to us about their experiences as Blacks or Asians or whatever their particular, and just educated us and allowed us to ask questions and make our mistakes. Because as you guys know, I'm really good at making mistakes when I'm trying to talk about that, and help to educate us in a very safe way. And then we're willing to hear our perspectives, going, oh gosh, I never realized. And, and then, one particular one was we had a couple of people say that a particular bank in town would not give loans to, they noticed their group did not get loans from that bank. And suddenly, our people were taking their money out of that bank and going to a different bank, and, making conscious decisions like that, where, if we can do little parts to help and learn, I think it makes a difference.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments? It's definitely something to reflect upon and think about. So what I'd like to do is ask you to get into your smaller groups, and there's 2 different questions that I'm asking you to look at. Oh, here, I've got to do this again. Where is it? Is it this? No, that's not it. Okay, so there's the Peasants' War, and then there's the discussion about sin as disobedience from God. So I think I said all of this to you, so you should have this glasses in your. It's on. Actually, I didn't send it. It's on the Populi. So I'm wondering if does any group, I can just do this randomly. Okay, so let's give the Doves a discussion about do you have any preference? Do you want to talk about the Peasants' War and Luther, or do you want to talk about sin? All right, so you guys do the Peasants' War and Luther. And then the Lambs will be doing the discussion about sin. And I hope that both of you will reflect upon both of these, but this is just the opportunity to kind of share and talk with each other about what your thoughts are. I hope everybody had an opportunity to reflect upon that before class. So breakout rooms. So
can I say something real quick?
Yeah, please.
Okay, before we go to break, just kind of getting back to that discussion that we had on racism and that article. I think one thing that particularly white folks can do is to admit that they're racist themselves. Like, there is this tendency, even in this article, there's this tendency to shift immediately to these outward shows and these outward expressions and these demonstrations of what can be done. But it's not very often, in my own experience, that I hear a white person say, I am racist and I want to change. Or I'm having a dinner and Uncle Joe says something racist, you know, say something to your uncle, say something in those. I think it's easier to go to a protest, or it's easier to invite people of color into your space than to recognize the racism in your own self and to correct an individual person who is making a racist statement or a racist action, to confront them, especially if it's a family member, in conversation, to actually do something in that immediate moment and space.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's particularly difficult. I'll just say for myself, and it's difficult for persons who are white and liberal to say that they're racist because they don't experience themselves as racist. But it might be easier to say, I have implicit racial bias that I'm working to try to relieve. Is that too much of a cop-out, do you think, or?
I'm not gonna make a blanket statement that it's a cop-out, but I think that it is interesting. I will say that. I do find that problematic. I do. Problematic. I'm not accusing every white person, obviously, of being racist, but it's the water that we're swimming in. This is, I don't know.
Yeah. So the water is, I mean, it's really hard to be breathing without contributing to the racism. Is that?
No? I think that's fair.
Okay.
I'm going to throw my hat in here. I was going to stay quiet on this one. But as far as I believe in calling everything what it is. So if you do a racist act, or you are participant in a racist act, or are amongst others that are committing a racist act, and you are not going against that, then you could be attributed to racism, because we're thinking of it as a systematic thing. And along those lines, if you're living a life, and a lot of people do live in like blissful ignorance of what they do not know or have not experienced, so they can live their lives and do something for a long time and not realize it is racist, even though it might be, and just your understanding of it is skewed. However, I still think those things are racist. Like, that does not deny the fact that what is committed or what is being done is racist. And if you call it any other name, I think you're still living a little bit in denial. And then also, I do believe it is a cop-out because you're trying to ease the blow for you, not for the person it's affecting. So for example, or even just not just the blow for you, but you're not taking into consideration fully how this is making or affecting someone else's life. Because if it's, say for instance, I'm gonna give this example, happened recently. There was a commentator who was over this high school basketball game, girls basketball game, and one of the teams took a knee during the anthem. And he did not realize that his mic was still hot. And he said, "These effing N-words," right? Yeah. And so then people called him out on that, of course, right? And his response was, "Well, I'm not racist. It happened because of my diabetes." That is weird. That in some regards, it's hilarious, because how in the world does your diabetes affect your reaction to girls taking a knee and calling them out of, calling them something derogatory that is clearly racist? Yeah. And then trying to deny that and place blame somewhere else. Yeah. So calling it anything other than racist and trying to say that I'm not a racist, but you just committed a racist act.
Yeah.
Right. So like, what, big or small, if there is some aspect of you that is racist or commits a racist act, like you have to claim that there has to be some accountability and ownership. And him saying that, in this instance, him saying, well, I'm not a racist, is trying to ease the blow so he doesn't have to face the consequences of everything that's going to come along with it.
Yeah.
But if you own that and say, you know what, I did say something that was racist, I have skewed beliefs and I need to fix how I think, that's a whole different narrative. Like, you can work with some, okay, you were raised, you were taught this, and this is what you believe. And you realize what you believe is now wrong. So now we can correct that. But if you don't realize that you have committed something that is hurtful to others and deny that fact, then you're never gonna fix the root of the issue.
Yeah.
So that's my whole thing. So anything that is done, I'm like, no, that's still racist because you're not owning that, you're not gonna fix the issue. So he could end up on some other commentating thing or whatever. He doesn't have to call the next team of African American women the N-word.
Yeah.
But that still is that aura is still giving off. He's still, his mindset hasn't changed.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's really helpful. I think it's hard for me personally to say that I'm racist, but it's much easier to say that I know that I have some racist bias that I don't want to have, that I want to work through, because it's really clear to me that I don't want to be racist. So, and that's just me sharing. So maybe that's.
I think there's a difference between the racist bias versus like the stereotypes that we all fall into play. Like, stereotypes and the things we may think of different cultures happens as well. But when we think of, again, the racist bias, I think falls a little closer to like, this is something that you've known all your life and you did not realize that this was an issue, or like the systematic aspect of it. You didn't realize or know this was the effect that it was having on a group of people versus I consider the full extent of racism to be more along the lines of like, you're doing this with intent.
Yeah.
So the racist bias may be unintentional. The actual racism is more intentional, but it's still racist.
Yeah. That's a helpful distinction, but I think it's really helpful, and it's helpful for me as a white person to figure out what ways in which my assumptions are still racist in some way, but without being explicitly or intentionally racist. And so that's where I find it hard sometimes. Sometimes it's things I just didn't know about. Other times it's things that maybe are implicit in the way that I was raised or the way the culture was when I was growing up. And so working through that I think in some ways there's a lot of grief for the liberal white folks because we didn't think that we were racist, but we've got racist assumptions. And so we're really working on that, or really needing to figure out how to work on that better, I guess I would say.
Well, one last thing, because I know we have to move on, but it's really interesting. I just did a paper on, I'm doing a class with, I can't remember his name. Anyway, It's on Dr. King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And we were reading a letter from Birmingham City Jail. And in that letter, as you guys I'm sure know, one of Dr. King's biggest disillusionment was with white liberal Christians. Yeah. And because there is such a idea that I can't possibly be racist, because, and there's usually a list of all the reasons why. But I think that's why conversations like this are really important, because that's usually, and even in my experience, the biggest pushback that I have received from people in terms of racism are people who consider themselves to be liberal white Christians. Mm-hmm. Some of the biggest blinders. And so I think that's why it's really important to have these conversations with people, particularly people of color, so that we can kind of call you on it, right? And I'm not saying you, but it's just critical. And you got to trust when we tell you. Mm-hmm. It's not how you feel or what you think. I'm going to tell you. And it's not on you to decide if you're racist, right? It's not on the person if someone's oppressing someone. It's not on the onus of the oppressor to say, oh, well, no, it's the person who is on the receiving end of the mistreatment or the receiving end of the implicit bias or whatever, to say, okay, let me call you on this because I don't have that. I can see it. This is how it's affecting me. You're not going to know how it's affecting that person. So trust us when we tell you, right? Yeah. And I think that's important. So
thank you. That's very well said. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you. Any other comments or questions before we come into our group? I'd really like you to have, I can't read the clock.
Jackie has a question or.
Oh, okay, somebody speak.
Oh, that's okay. I was just gonna say that there was some quote that came to my mind when James was talking about the only thing that evil needs to triumph is for somebody to do nothing. And I can't remember what the last part was other than the doing nothing part. And so I think this was a good reminder that I thought it was good people, but that didn't sound quite right. But I thought this was a good reminder that is in this context of evil and sin. If we continue to do nothing, it's all just going to continue to perpetuate in the community. And so it's our job to figure out what our part is.
Yes, and I really appreciate Adrian and James, both of you speaking up, because sometimes I feel like there's some issues that I don't know how persons of color are responding to it. And it's really helpful to hear your perspective and your voices to be able to think, okay, I need to think about this a little differently here and this a little differently there. So I know that you don't have to do that. And I appreciate you taking the risk and saying it and speaking out and helping.
And can I just throw this in there too before we move on? Just the fact is some along the lines of what Adrian said and even Jackie and what I said. Just the idea is, when we're calling you out on being racist, or if there is something that is a racist act that, we're like, hey, like, don't do that. We're not calling people out to make them feel guilty. Like, that's not the issue. It's us speaking up for ourselves and being, hey, this either made me upset, this hurt me, this made me sad, this affected me in a capacity that is harmful to me, right, and others. So I'm telling you, don't do this again for my sake or anybody else you come along in contact with later on. Like, that's not the way to treat this situation or to think about that. So we're never like trying to guilt trip anybody. We're not trying to make you suffer. Or one of the ideas I think some people have is like, we're trying to, we're like, for example, Black Lives Matter or Black supremacy or anything like that. Like, that's not, Black Lives Matter is not Black supremacy. Like, Black Lives Matter is equality. We're not trying to take over and then flip the dynamics of the system. We're just trying to be included in the system. So it's never us trying to guilt trip you and we're talking about we need reparations for this and all this and like, no, we want the systematic change to happen so that we don't have to walk outside and wonder, is this going to be my last day for whatever reason, or be paranoid just to, you know, for any other reason, like for wearing my hood up, you know, at night. Like the things we take into consideration are different. So we don't want to have to walk around in that fear and these different dynamics, but it's never to, you know, again, it's never to guilt trip anybody. It's never to make you feel the suffering that we felt over these years. It's literally trying to get that equality aspect out of our lives, because it feels very one-sided. So like everything we do can be, you know, dragged, and then nobody else does any wrong. So I just wanted to put that out there too.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I really appreciate both of you. I know it can be hard or stressful or maybe make you feel a little uncomfortable to go ahead and say these things in our class, and I deeply appreciate you sharing with us. Thank you. I'd like us to go ahead and get into groups, and I'm aware that we've got about 20 minutes. So what I'm going to suggest you do is just get into your groups, and then when you get to 4 o'clock to leave, so that you have enough time to be in the groups. And I'm going to invite you to whatever the group decides, whichever of the questions to focus on, your group can talk about. And my hope is that whichever one you pick, you'll also take a look at the other one as well, to get a good sense. So I will put you into your small groups, and let's see who's in group, which people are in which groups again. I guess Tareya is not here, so the Lambs will just have a couple of folks. Unless you all just want to be in one group together, do you want to talk about that in one group, or is it easier to do it in the smaller groups? It's probably easier to do it in the smaller groups, isn't it? Okay. Okay, well, thank you all for some good conversation and good reflection. We'll see you at the end of after Easter. Happy Easter.